Hi y'all, this is Sierra. I'm the collections manager here at the Newcomb Art Museum. I'm here to show you some collections of the Newcomb Pottery and talk to you a little bit about that history. This is the first time I've done this digitally, so please bear with me. But I'm gonna try to add some photos on top so we can get some nice close-ups, and I'll put some links down at the bottom for you guys to get some more information. So I'm here in collection storage on site in the museum. We have about 800 pieces of Newcomb pottery that we store here. We are one of the largest collections of Newcomb pottery, definitely the largest that is accessible to the public. We have a lot of those objects online. Do check out our website. I'll put a link down at the bottom so you can get some nice close-up images and a little more information about the collection that we hold. So Newcomb Pottery was a commercial enterprise that was started at Newcomb College, which was a conglomerate of Tulane. So really we have always had this partnership with Tulane University. Newcomb College we know does not exist anymore, but we hold on to that name, we hold on to that legacy, and we're really here to protect the art of Newcomb pottery and what that stands for. So when I say that it was a commercial enterprise, what that means was, I think a really big misconception of Newcomb pottery was that this was student work. I want to say that right off the bat and say that these were professional artists. When Newcomb College was started, we see really the first college university to start granting women degrees. But there's this crisis in that we're training women with all of these skills, but not giving them any jobs, not anything to do with them. So the question became, okay, we're gonna educate women, we're gonna give them a degree, but then what do? They can't become self-sufficient, they can't go get a job, because we're still looking, this is the 1890s, there's still not a lot of opportunity for women. So Newcomb College really early on in their start decides that what they're gonna do is set up a program directly for their graduates where they can hire their students back to then be able to make money in the skill that they learned at the school. It was really this kind of socialist experiment. So here we have all these women who are learning ceramics, learning design, learning painting, drawing, all of these different elements, and then once they graduate, if they show promise, Newcomb College is then gonna hire them back to produce work that they can go sell and earn a living, and then Newcomb can say, look how we train these women, and we're giving them life skills that they actually are using. And this was the case. We can look back at some census records and see that these women listed their profession as artists. A lot of them, after they left the pottery, continued on to go do some of their own work on their own. You know, we had a few jewelers and painters, but a lot of women who are working in ceramics as well. So I want to start and just kind of jump right in and look at some objects here. Ironically, the first one I wanted to show you is not a piece of Newcomb pottery. This little picture here was made at the Cotton Centennial. So that is happening right here in Audubon Park. We know that William Woodward, who was just brought from Massachusetts by Tulane University to set up an art program here, he becomes really instrumental in setting up both the art program at Newcomb as well as the architecture program here at Tulane that still is thriving. Both of these are still thriving. So Woodward is seeing a lot of exposure to other art ceramics. There is a women's pavilion, we know, at the Cotton Centennial where they're showing art and craft and anything that women can really offer to society. There also are a lot of ceramics. So Woodward, and he gets inspired, he petitions Tulane to let him partake in the Cotton Centennial, and he participates teaching painting and drawing, but they also start a pottery club. We know that the two teachers of the pottery club were Joseph Meyer, who we will talk about in a little bit, and George Orr. George Orr becomes super famous for, he's known as the Mad Potter of Biloxi, he is a student of Joseph Meyer, but goes on to really revolutionize what ceramics becomes. He might come up a little later in our conversation, but not the main player here. But this is really nice. I probably can't see it here. I'll give you a little close-up picture, but on the bottom says the Pottery Club of New Orleans. So like I said, we really like to think of that as the precursor for ceramics program here in New Orleans. It's really the early inspiration for Tulane getting involved in the arts and specifically looking at ceramics. So the next piece I'll show you is this little plate. Now, this plate is also not Newcomb Pottery, but it was made here at Newcomb. I'll give you a close-up of this guy as well. This piece would have been made by a student here at Tulane at Newcomb. So, like I said earlier, that these pieces were a commercial enterprise. I think I said that earlier. These are a commercial enterprise. It was set up for women once they were graduated to go work. So this was not art that was made by students. This was art made by professional artists. This piece, however, was made by a student, and I like to show this example to really illustrate how the students were learning art. This is really a great example of applied design. We see this as one set of little buds repeated several times around the plate. So this is an example of a student learning math and how to calculate a circumference and how many times the design is going to fit, how to get it perfect. It's also applied design, how to move your drawing off of a 2D piece of paper onto a 3D element. Now this is porcelain. Again, I'll show you the back. We can see that there actually is a stamp here that indicates this is a piece of porcelain from France. But we have a signature of the artist, and that would have been the student who would have applied this design. So that's just to give you a little bit of background, not so much what's happening at Newcomb, but really kind of that foundation of where they're coming from and how we're starting this pottery program here. So the real first piece that I wanted to look at is this really lovely guy here. This is this object is called a TIG. It's called a TIG because it has 3 handles, and this is a reference to some classical Greek pottery, classical medieval pottery maybe is more accurate. The 3 handles meant that each sitter at a table would have a side that they would drink out of. So it's kind of a symbol of friendship and community and camaraderie. So this became kind of a symbolic object for the Newcomb women to have made, because it's putting Newcomb kind of in that canon of important ceramics. So this is a really early example, and what I wanted to show you is how the design is applied here. We see that it's a really smooth surface. It's very, very shiny. There's kind of some streaks. If you look really closely, you can see that the paint, that the glaze here is quite streaky. Now the reason for that is the artist here would have been painting the design onto an already finished piece of ceramic. If anyone's done ceramics today, we know you just kind of dunk it in a big vat of glaze. That is not what they were doing here. They had a paintbrush and a little jar of pigment, and then they would apply that to the ceramic surface. So this is a good place to back up a little bit and to talk about how this piece would have been made. A lot of people ask me this, so I'm just going to jump out. The women did not physically throw the pieces on the wheel. Joseph Meyer, who we talked about a little bit earlier, was the potter here at Newcomb Pottery. In the early years, he was here for quite a long time, into the 30s. So the men threw the vessel. That offends a lot of people when I tell them that. So I want to kind of break that down and look at what does that mean. First of all, I think it's important to realize if anybody's worked in clay, it's a pretty physical activity. The wedging of the clay takes a lot of work. Sitting at the potter's wheel takes a lot of work. Now, they were not using electric potter's wheel like we use now. These were kick wheels, something that you would sit down and physically you had to use your leg and kick it, and you had to keep it very even. So that was very physical. Not saying that women couldn't do something that was physical, but when you think of the time period, the role of women, this is right at the turn of the century, 1900. You think of the fashion that women wore big poofy dresses. To sit at a potter's wheel with like a big hunk of clay right in between your legs was not something that was considered ladylike at the time. So for that chapter, it didn't really make sense for women to do that role. I think it's also really important to note as well that ceramics at the time was still really considered industry. It was not considered art. That's not saying that Newcomb pottery was not considered art, but what was the art was the decoration, was the applied design. Joseph Meyer, who's the potter, was trained as a brick maker. He worked in ceramics kilns and dug his own clay, and he was trained to really make industry. And ceramics at the time, the actual clay and firing of the clay was still considered to be industry. So that's also really important. Remember George Orr, we mentioned him. Now there's some rumor that George Orr did work at Newcomb Pottery very briefly, but he didn't stay because he had a real disagreement, let's say, with what ceramics was happening in the world, because he really saw the vessel itself as the work of art. Now if you're familiar with George Orr, he really was a master of throwing and shaping his pieces where he wasn't looking at ceramics as a surface to be decorated, much like this plate, right? It's a surface that already exists and we're applying design onto it. That was what Newcomb was doing. That being said, the women still had full control over their design. They could go through a catalog and pick exactly what shape they wanted. They could go down to Joseph Meyer in the ceramic studio and say, I want a bowl this high, this wide, about this shape, and he would make that for them. So even though they physically weren't doing it, it was kind of like having a fabricator make their work for them. They still did have full control over that design. So going back to this TIG, what we're seeing is this shape that they would have got the potter to make them, but the design would have been all the women who made this piece. Right, so this is a great, really early example. The next stage, so in 1901 is when we start to see Newcomb moving into this, what we call an incised design. So if you really compare the two here, you can see this is a very smooth, flat surface. This one we start to see some incising, some dimension. And if you look really close, we can see that there are lines being like cut into the design. So you have a little bit of more surface. This piece is really, I think it's really lovely, and we can see that it's cypress trees. So like the plate here, this is one tree that's repeated several times around the vase. It's pretty abstracted. We recognize that it's a tree, but it's not really what a tree looks like. So really kind of going into this graphic kind of style. Newcomb pottery was really inspired by the arts and crafts movement in England, which was a rejection of the factory system and a celebration of the artist and the individual. And we know also what's happening in England at that time is the Art Nouveau style is really popular. So this is a great example of an Art Nouveau kind of style of design here. Again, when we look at the bottom, we can see some really lovely marks here. We have the Newcomb cipher, which tells us that this is Newcomb pottery. We have Joseph Meyer's potter's stamp. We have a little Q, which is telling us the clay body. They dug the clays locally, so we know that this is a buff clay. That's what the Q tells us. The artist signature here, Roberta Kennan, and the AQ 45, which is the registration number, so we are able to date this 1905, I believe, is this piece. It's important to note here also, I'll talk a little bit about the artist signatures, and since I just mentioned that arts and craft movement, which is a rejection of the factory system, Newcomb really celebrated the individual artists. They did consider this art. They considered each woman the artist. It was important. The fact that they signed each piece really indicates that they're recognizing, again, the skill and craft of an individual artist. You can pull all works by Roberta Kennan and start to see some similarities in her style, how they really differ from some of the other artists in the collection. So that was a real perk for the artists. They got to work here and really develop their style and be encouraged to thrive. And then Newcomb also at this time started entering a lot of competitions. The 1901 to 1910 range is really when Newcomb thrives in terms of competitions. They're winning gold, silver, bronze, and individual artists were also allowed to contribute their own work under their own name, which I think is also really special. And we see like some of the Newcomb women are winning these awards as well. So really pushing the development of an individual artist here. And we'll move on to this piece. So in 1910, Paul Cox, who is the chemist and engineer here at Newcomb, so we've already talked about, we have the artists who are the women, and we have the potter, Joseph Meyer, and so they also had a chemist. So Paul Cox is the chemist. He was in charge of mixing the glazes, firing the kilns, digging the clays, kind of figuring out what temperature each clay needed, how it would react to different glazes. And he was the first, also kind of this industry side. But he was the first to really master this matte glaze. As you can see the comparison, very shiny. This one is a lot more translucent. So in 1910 is when Paul Cox and the Newcomb Pottery just kind of transitions away from this shiny glaze and is primarily making the matte glaze pieces. I love looking at these two together because they're really similar shapes. They're similar subject matters, they're trees, but you can really see the huge difference, the huge leap that Newcomb takes here. This piece, opposed to the incised guy who will move over, this piece we would consider to be, we'd call it a sculpted piece. As you can see, and we'll get some nice close-ups here for you, the women would have been both adding and taking away from the clay. So instead of just a two-dimension where you have a cut line, there's a lot more shape and a lot more variant in depth. So that's how we get this really sculptedness of the trees and the leaves and the moss, and you get to see a lot of dimension. And so this becomes much more of a landscape opposed to just the trees. That's a design that's repeated. You can see this has a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. I also like to note that it's not a repeated pattern. This is one image. If I took a knife, cut it down the side, and laid it out flat, it would be like one landscape image. So that's a huge jump that Newcomb is taking. You can see the bottom of this piece, very similar markings to the other ones. These are a little harder to see, but this is Anna Frances Simpson. And here we go, the famous moon behind the tree, which becomes a real icon of Newcomb Pottery. So I really like to introduce the conversation here of the difference between art and craft. We talked earlier about the promotion of individual artists and really that thriving of the individual artist. But here's when we can start to consider the market, capitalism, and really Newcomb as an industry, and still this kind of centralized loss, really. Because what we start to see around this era is these, what we call the Moss and Moon or the Moon and Tree series becomes incredibly popular. People love this design. They're buying quite a lot of it. And Newcomb College starts to see this as a moneymaker. So this is around the period when we start to see the individual artist really kind of being pushed aside for consistency of design. This Moss and Moon is said to be attributed to Sadie Irvine, but here we see in Anna Frances Simpson. We have countless artists kind of making the same design. We have records in their diaries starting to complain about this. They don't want to make other people's designs. They want to thrive as an artist. That's not totally happening here. Newcomb also is entering the same competitions that they were before, but instead of winning gold, silver, bronze, they actually are getting flat out rejected. The judges are saying, you've been making the same design over and over and over again, you really haven't changed. So it's really kind of when we start to see maybe a decline in artistic expression, but a real increase in production. Needless to say, you know, there's the survived World War I, we survived the Great Depression, but these are luxury items, and eventually the market does slow down. In 1939, 1940 is really when we start to see Newcomb Pottery ceasing production completely. That's really the end of the Newcomb experiment, the Newcomb enterprise. If we take a step back, we can say, okay, the point of Newcomb was to give women a job. In World War II, we know that that's happening elsewhere. Women don't have to just sit and make pottery. They're making tanks and guns, and they're nurses, they're in the front line. So the role of women in society has changed, which means that the role of arts as a realm of women is kind of over. So 1941 is really totally the end of Newcomb Pottery. But I want to talk about one last piece, which is this this nice guy here. We see after Newcomb Pottery closes, they reopen 1 year later, completely rebranded. They're no longer called the Newcomb Pottery, they're now being called the Newcomb Guild. So the Newcomb Guild, really a huge leap when we're comparing, you know, these two tree designs to this really like modern minimalist design. I love to say that it still really fits within the Newcomb aesthetic though. We see the same color of the blues and the greens, and it's also still representative of the local landscape, whereas here we have trees and flowers. Here, this piece is called Rainwear. So really what this is an abstraction of the natural landscape, which is what Newcomb Pottery was really representing in their early works. So not a huge change in subject matter, but a really huge change in representation. Remember when we talked about George Orr really early at the beginning, who's looking at the vessel itself as the artwork? Well, here you can really see that this is the vessel itself as an artwork. This is not applied design, this is the shape itself as design. It's I like to put this in the historical context of Fiesta ware coming on the market, and kind of the availability of ceramics that's mass produced. The guild pieces were mass produced in a way that the earlier pieces were not. It's really early modernism. I think also the exposure to Japan and to the Eastern style of ceramics that we see happening kind of in this post-war period. And really it's just a really minimalist, but it's I think they're like pretty fun pieces. Another big change here is we're moving away from graduates of Newcomb College. Newcomb Guild was just faculty. This was a faculty project for the ceramics instructors to be able to make a little bit extra money on the side. That because of that, they're no longer signing the bottom of the pieces. This one still has a price tag on it, so you can't really see, but if I were to pull the price tag off of it, at the bottom would just be the Newcomb cipher, no more artist signatures or dates or any other information, because this is really in the spirit of modernism, function and form, and not a lot of extra frou-frou design. So the Newcomb Guild really lasts for a whole another 10 years. We see it in operation from 1941 to 1951. And but unfortunately the college was no longer promoting it or selling it. They really saw their mission as to be teachers and no longer have this marketplace side. So most of the Newcomb Guild that's in our collection is actually leftover inventory. So we kind of say that Newcomb ceased production completely in 1951, and that's when we got to see really another huge revolution in ceramics that's happening here at Tulane with the hiring of Choi. She is this master ceramicist who is really, again, looking at the vessel itself as the art, not a platform for design to be applied to, but art in and of itself. And I think the Newcomb Guild is really kind of, again, this precursor for the next wave of thinking about ceramics. And we're seeing a really strong, modernist, contemporary, really edgy ceramics coming out of Tulane today. And I think it fits really well within this Newcomb story. A question I get quite a lot is how much did this pottery cost? I don't think I mentioned that earlier. So a piece like this probably would be on the market at the time for $300 or $400, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you adjust that for inflation at the time period, that comes to be about $150, $200. So these were expensive pieces. These were luxury items. They were meant to be special. They were meant to be art. It was not something that you would buy to put flowers in, to eat your breakfast off of, to drink your coffee. But you could still do that because it was supposed to be functional also. You just got to be really lucky if you got to have your toast on this lovely Newcomb plate. That's really all I can think of telling you this story. Newcomb, of course, did dabble in some other industries. There's some really lovely textiles that I have behind me. If anyone was wondering what those were. Now, those were really, since the women who were working in Newcomb, they were being trained in art. So they were taking painting, drawing, textile. And some of them just didn't want to do pottery. They wanted to do silver, or they wanted to do embroidery. And so Newcomb Pottery did make some room for that. There was a little shop on campus that was kind of like a gift store that people coming to New Orleans would come and stop by and visit, buy a little souvenir. And we do know that they were selling quite a lot of silver jewelry and some embroidery in there as well. But really, pottery is their main focus. And we know that in their existence, which was really a 50-year operation, they made probably between 70 and 100,000 pieces. So that's quite a lot. We don't know how many are still in the world. Every once in a while they pop up like at Goodwill or something, but right now they're really considered antiques and very special. And I personally am really grateful to be able to work with this collection, and I will be online if anyone has any questions. I will try to get back to you, and again, check out our website, see a lot more other examples, and thank you for coming by, sticking with it. I know I have a lot to say, and this was a long talk, so thank you guys, and I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy in these weird times. Bye.